Most of us want something to believe in. Most of us need some kind of faith, some sort of belief in a higher power. And so that shifted for many educated people from a belief in God to nature. So nature became sort of the new God.
Well, unfortunately, I think the number one principle for the environmental movement is submission.
So you see this whole new morality that gets constructed: vegetarianism, not driving, not flying, sorting your trash and recycling.
What it requires is submission to the agenda. I absolutely think that people who are leading this movement, and not just the environmental movement, the fringe catastrophic climate change, a sector of that movement, are using fear.
So if you look case by case at the things that could actually conceivably happen, according to climate scientists, even the most far-fetched ones, if you factor in our amazing ability to adapt, there is no possibility of a climate catastrophe.
What are your three biggest fears?
Trump, coronavirus, and the climate.
That the planet withering away to a point where we can't live on it anymore. Like, there's just where you don't have a life.
And I think it may be the end of our civilization.
So when Greta Thunberg says, "You've ruined my childhood, you've stolen my childhood," she's talking about the end of the world.
Fear is a very, very powerful motivator. So most movements that are trying to succeed use fear.
The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change.
And every night on the TV news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
What are some of the negative consequences of telling people that this is apocalyptic and the world's going to end?
I think we've seen some very significant mental health impacts of this apocalyptic environmental discourse, particularly on climate change. So we now know there have been surveys that 1 out of 5 children in Britain suffer nightmares from climate change. I think that the numbers are probably very similar in the United States. I suspect that they're even higher.
How many years do you think we have left?
Oh, that's such an apocalyptic question right now.
I would say maybe 400.
Like 150, 200 maybe. 20 years tops at the most. I've also had tornado nightmares where you wake up and it's like 120 degrees out.
Fear is such a controlling emotion. For most humans, it's the strongest emotion. And people who have an agenda know that. So I think it only makes sense, and they're targeting the young. And really, we shouldn't tolerate this.
We have no more than 12 years to take incredibly bold action on this crisis.
What I'm saying is the planet's on f***ing fire.
So I think to understand how climate change became a religion, you have to go back to the late 19th century. One German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, pointed out that as belief in God and the afterlife declined, people would create new religions. And that's what happened in the early part of the 20th century, the rise of fascism, then the rise of communism. They basically acted as two new religions for people, two new moralities. They were both apocalyptic in their own way. After communism was discredited in the United States and around the world in the 50s, environmentalism took over that role on the left.
Traditional faiths are declining in America and Europe, around the world. And so this is kind of taking the place. People have to have something to believe in. They need something bigger than themselves. And so this is just a convenient, I think, substitute.
A common narrative in religions is that if you violate the God's commandments, then you're going to be punished with some sort of hell. And you can see there's an enormous parallel between this and what you could call the modern environmentalist commandment that we shouldn't impact the earth. There's just this assumption that if we have any impact on climate, or if we consume resources, or we put more plastics into the world, then it must be just a total catastrophe.
That our activities are changing the climate. And if we don't act forcefully, we'll continue to see rising oceans, longer, hotter heat waves, dangerous droughts and floods.
And scientifically, this is just completely unfounded. In general, our impact on the world makes it a better place to live. We're much safer than we used to be, and we have a much more abundant world. The culture as a whole has accepted a religion that's an anti-human impact religion. We think it's wrong for us to impact nature, And we think that if we do, there must be disastrous consequences.
And so what climate change is, it offers almost a superhero fantasy, that there's something that threatens the end of the world, and we as individuals will save the world. I mean, it is like a Marvel comic strip, sort of. And so I think what's reversed, what's happened with the rise of the secular religion, is that individuals adopt a kind of messianic, story where they are themselves the Messiah, something that is rejected by most traditional religions.
There's a lot of pressure to switch over to renewables. Is that a reasonable solution for our energy needs?
We're forcing taxpayers and ratepayers to subsidize, for example, renewable energy, meaning wind and solar, instead of traditional fuels. Well, here's the truth. To power the state of Texas with just wind or solar, you would need an area 5 times the size of Harris County, which is Houston, and the surrounding suburbs, if you include the wind farms, the solar farms, and the transmission lines. That's not going to happen.
There's a projection that there's a 10x, 20x demand for additional rare earth minerals to meet the kind of expectations for batteries and storage that many of the renewable strategies actually are backstopped by. In places like the US, we've actually decided we don't want to do that kind of mining because it's not environmentally responsible, et cetera. And actually be able to do the mining, deliver it, and have it be reliable and sustainable, that in my mind is magical thinking. We've had windmills all the way back to Christ's era on Earth. These are not new.
We have the facilities right here at home to dispose of our waste properly. It seems like they have us caught in this daily ritual just to keep us engaged. Does any good come from these practices?
Well, they certainly make sacrifices. And in this case, the sacrifices can often be merely symbolic. They just don't get anything in return. So the average person, for example, might think that taking the stairs is better than taking the elevator, or walking to work is better than taking the subway. So many sacrifices. I'm not going to use a plastic straw. There are all these things that you can do, but the question is, what are you really getting in return for that? It's almost something that kind of assuages the conscience of the person who's participating more than it has a realistic effect on the world around them.
Could you talk about the basics of human adaptation?
The thing to recognize about climate is that it is inherently dangerous. So whether we have an impact on it or not, we're always going to have devastating storms. We're always going to have floods. We're always going to have sea levels rising and falling. That's a very common local phenomenon. So the question is, what is our ability to master climate? What is our ability to take the different kinds of changes and dangers in climate and deal with it? And basically, 200 years ago, nobody had much of an ability to deal with climate, and so they were overwhelmed by climate, to the point that historically religions pray to climate gods because climate is so volatile and so dangerous to people. And basically what happens is, once you have machine power, then you have the ability to produce defenses against climate, so you can do things like warm yourself up when it's cold or cool yourself when it's hot. And so basically, the greater your productive ability is, the greater your ability to deal with climate, and your productive ability depends on your ability to use machines, which depends on low-cost energy.
Yeah, I grew up about 40 miles west of Pittsburgh in a little steel town called Steubenville, Ohio. I would come through the Liberty Tunnel coming into downtown Pittsburgh, and I couldn't see across to the other side of the river. Absolutely covered with smoke, and it was often referred to in my hometown as pay dirt. People didn't care to have that be part of their community. There's a push in terms of how do we make this industry more sustainable. That touched everything in the industry, not just the environmental footprint, but the sustainability being defined in the steel industry is, how do I continue to source the materials that I'm going to use? What kind of technology am I using? And much of the new technology that was employed other places in the country really transformed the city from what it was to what it is today. And I think that's part of the emergence of it all. It wasn't that the steel industry as it was originally defined, was moved somewhere else. It was a transformation of that industry, using new technologies, using environmentally responsible and advanced technologies that also produced better products that were competitively priced and competitive in a global marketplace. And that's really what changed the industry in many ways, is looking at what sustainability really means.
Nowhere in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or in any of the serious scientific literature are there predictions of the apocalypse. In fact, it's surprising to most people to learn that there's no predictions of increasing deaths from natural disasters or diseases or any of the other things that many people expect to get worse under climate change.
When some of these children who are here are my age, here's what it's going to be. Within less than 50 years, it'll be here.
Something on the order of 50% of people think our species is going to go extinct. And so what this shows is there's just a fundamental failure of education and communication that, instead of telling people what scientists actually think, are telling them a completely exaggerated and distorted version of it in order to scare them.
Honestly, I feel that man is kind of a parasite on Earth.
Well, I think industrialization has been a parasite. I think capitalism has been a parasite to the earth.
We're overpopulated. We take and take and take, and we don't try to refurbish or take care of it, so.
Like, we're killing it. We truly are. And we should be nurturing it and worshiping it and taking care of it, but we're not.
There are stories literally every few months showing that representations made about catastrophic climate change haven't come true, and they're ignored.
People have heard so much about climate change, but they don't know some of the basic facts. Natural disasters aren't getting worse. In fact, they're getting better. The number of people that die from natural disasters has declined over 90% over the last 100 years. They've declined over 80% over the last 40 years. We should be celebrating this fact. It's mostly occurred because our infrastructure is more hardened. We're more prepared for natural disasters. We have better weather forecasting systems. So when a hurricane comes to, whether it's Florida or Haiti or Bangladesh, we can prepare for it. We can get ourselves into safe environments. So that's great news. Damage to property has increased, but it's entirely explained by the fact that we're just much wealthier than we were. So if you look at a picture of Miami Beach in 1920, picture of Miami Beach today, just a lot more buildings on it. So when a hurricane hits them, there's more damage. So that's great news. There is no scenario in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which oversees all the science of this, for that trend to reverse itself. In other words, it's not to say it's impossible, but there's no science suggesting that climate change is going to become so bad that the number of deaths from natural disasters stops going down and starts going back up again.
Whatever the scientists say, I'm going to go with people that are actually in that world. They tell me.
If you had to boil it all down, what are those behind this movement really after?
It requires submission to one government, because, if we only control pollution here, but not in China, what good does it do us? None. So it necessarily requires that there be jurisdiction exerted around the entire globe and that everyone be on board. It also requires there be fewer of us. If you really get down to the bottom line of what they're after, they want fewer humans on the planet. And when it comes time to decide how to whittle down the human population, I doubt they're going to eliminate themselves and their offspring.
The leading thinkers are very explicitly anti-human. So they'll say something like, human beings are a cancer on the earth. That's not a pro-human perspective. It means there's something higher than human beings, namely the rest of the earth, and you consider human beings an impediment.
I mean, you have to remember that the elite, whether the people that run the New York Times, the people that, the Democratic politicians, the scientists at the universities, the well-educated activists, the vast majority of them are very secular people. They really don't have a traditional religion. And so they have constructed this new religion.
Doomsday cultists have predicted the imminent end of the world for all of recorded history. They have always been wrong, just as wrong as the environmental alarmists are today.